My subject this morning, adding impetus to initiative. Adding impetus to initiative. And so the talk this morning has to do with action, right action. And the motivating power of action or volition is will. Will is behind all things. When God created the universe, He used His will, that's all. And so when we do anything, we use our will. Of course, that will may be of different kinds, as I will come to in a minute. Now, the definition of initiative is self-reliant enterprise. Self-reliant enterprise, or self-confidence plus action. And the thing to remember is that self-confidence comes first from making contact with God, I mean in the ultimate, and the action comes from putting your will into it, which is, in the case of contact with God, God's will. If you remember just that this morning about impetus, make the contact with God, then your will becomes His will. Then you'll have plenty of initiative. And so self-reliant enterprise or initiative can lead to success in worldly things and also in spiritual things. The modus operandi, so to speak, is the same. You can be a success in worldly things, but it is far better to be a success in spiritual things because therein you consummate the goal of life. Just remember those two things. Now, in all initiative, as I have said, the dynamo is volition or will. Some people, you know, they just go along kind of easy. Others have the push. The push, so to speak, or initiative, is will. And there are two kinds of will which we are interested in this morning. First is mechanical will. Mechanical will is automatic in its action, and therefore it is not as strong as conscious will. When you use mechanical will, you are acting in an automatic way. You're an automaton, so to speak. But when you use independent action and consciously work from the soul, not from habit or outward stimulation, so to speak, but from the inner dictates of the soul, then your will becomes conscious, dynamic will. And that's the will that gives impetus to initiative. Just realize those two kinds of will as we discussed this morning. The mechanical will, automatic will, and the will which comes from independent action. And that's conscious will, real conscious will. And with that will, your will becomes one with God's will. That's the great thing to remember. Now, in every walk of life, there are those who remain unsuccessful simply because they lack initiative. In other words, they're guided by their everyday habits, and they are really automatons. There is no real conscious initiative put in their action, because everything is the result of habit, as I have said. They're guided by worldly habits and worldly consciousness. And therefore they are what we call automatons. On the other hand, these automatons just drift along with the tide. They go out and they do what habit dictates to them. They use automatic will, mechanical will, and drift along with the tide. It's pretty easy to drift along with the tide. You don't have to do anything. And therefore, that's why many people are not really successful, because they lack that true initiative. On the other hand, those people who, through independent action, resist the tide of worldly consciousness and automatic living and following the dictates of habits which they have acquired, those people who resist the tide, they act not from habit, worldly habit, but from the dictates of soul consciousness. And remember, your soul and my soul and everyone's soul is a ray of God. Now, if you can consciously act in contact with your soul, then you perform independent action. You are not an automaton, you are a free man, being guided by God's great presence which is within each and every one of us, our soul. Those are the two main things to remember in this subject, impetus, in increasing this willpower which is within us, increasing our initiative. If you act in an automatic way, it doesn't take much will, does it? But if you act independently, go against the tide which millions of people are following or allowing to push them along, you go against that, then it takes more power, and by so doing, you act from soul, and soul is one with God, therefore your will becomes one with God's great will. That's why some have more impetus than others. Some have a greater power than others. Some have greater initiative. Now, Master used to say, in illustrating these two types of people, the automatons, so to speak, he used to say those are the ones who get up, and wake up somehow. Then they have breakfast, lunch, dinner. Then they do the work, the drudgery, around the house or in the office and so forth. Then they come home, fool around a little bit, some more than they should, and go to sleep, do the same thing over and over every day. This father was showing his son the family album, and he came to his wedding picture. Junior says, "Was that the time," he says, "was this the day when Mom came to work for us?" So you see, work can be drudgery, even if you're married. So let us not be an automaton, but I think Master, in his own words in his autobiography, has pointed it out better than I can when he says, some people seem to defy progress, preferring well-worn ruts of thought and activity. I call such people psychological antiques, he says. Don't be one of them, lest when you die the angels say, "Oh, here comes an antique. Let's send him back to earth." So, remembering that little story, perhaps it'll help us not to be just an automaton, but a person of independent action and real initiative. Now, the power of initiative is in everyone. Some do not show it, but nevertheless it's there. Why? Because we're all souls, and souls are rays of God. And therefore that power is within us, if you can arouse it. Some people it doesn't seem to be there, but it is there. It's in everyone for the simple reason that it has not been aroused and exploited in some people, but everybody has the power of God within them. The presence of God is within each one of us, otherwise we wouldn't be a soul, or rather we wouldn't be a human being, a child of God. Therefore, now we come to the question, how can we arouse this initiative? How can we develop it? How can we make it more powerful so that we can accomplish things? How can we add impetus to it? First, we can do it by emulating others. Those who have done great things in their particular line of endeavor, both in material ways and spiritual ways. We can emulate them. But the first thing to remember is that we have to change from automatic action to independent action which comes from soul contact. If you want to emulate a businessman, for instance, you cannot do it by automatic action, just going there and looking at him and following along without much push. You've got to get down to business with him. You've got to study him, study his methods. You've got to use initiative with yourself first. And then as he is a great businessman, by doing that, emulating him, you too will acquire some of the initiative which he has. That's the first thing to remember in increasing this power of initiative within us. Secondly, and this is far better, we can do it by wisdom, by proper discipline and training, such as following self-realization fellowship. We can, through wisdom, increase our independent action and thereby unite our will with God's will, because self-realization fellowship gives you the techniques and the meditations whereby you can contact God. As I spoke this morning, as the great Word, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. Now self-realization will give you the techniques whereby you will attain that wisdom through contact with the presence of God within. That'll certainly give you impetus for greater initiative, without question of a doubt. So that second way is better. For instance, to illustrate this, you take the Master. All of us whom are loyal to his work try to emulate him. And what a spiritual dynamo he was. Why? Because he lived with God, knew God, and was one with him. Just as Jesus said, "The things I do, ye shall do, and greater things." That means each one of us has within us the power of initiative. Only it's covered up, so to speak. It has not been exploited. We must exploit it. And for that reason, or why we should, I will come to in just a moment. Master has given an illustration which I'd like to give you at this time as follows. There are three types of devotees, he says. Believers that attend church and are satisfied. My father went to that church, so did my grandfather. So I'm perfectly satisfied. That's the first type. Second, believers that live an upright life, but make no effort to achieve oneness with God. That's the thing. And third, believers that are determined to discover their true identity. And those who are determined, they use independent action. They're not just automatons like people come to some churches and sit there. They get some good out of it. But the one who is determined to know that he is one with God, he uses independent action. And he is guided and directed from his soul. And when he is determined, his determination is backed up by the power of God's will, which his will becomes. So there you see, there is another reason why or how we can develop initiative. But the greatest way is to get contact with the all-powerful initiative of God's presence within you. That's the greatest way. That comes from regular and deep meditation. And as I've said before, when you do that, your little puny will becomes God's will. Otherwise, how, as we look through religious history, do these great things happen about the martyrs and the great men of God? Why? Because something came into them, something was exploited which was not there. Their will was changed from mechanical will or ordinary human will to divine will. That surely is impetus enough to increase their initiative to follow truth. So there you have the three ways whereby you, each one of us, can, right from this moment on, stimulate the initiative within us, as I have just pointed out. As you follow this last way, the greatest way, be a perfectionist in what you do. To get contact with God, you must be a perfectionist in meditation. You can't just fumble through it. You've got to be a perfectionist. And whatever you do in life, be a perfectionist in that. If you meditate regularly, and are determined, as I spoke, or Master speaks about those who are determined to know they are one with God, you'll be a perfectionist in your meditation, and thereby you will accomplish something. Be a perfectionist in attainment of God. That's the greatest thing. Understand that. Accept the part which you have to play in life willingly. But do it in a perfect way. It doesn't make any difference whether you're sweeping the floor or making beds or whatever you're doing. Do it, realizing you're doing it to please God. Be a perfectionist in it. And when you come to your meditation, if you are a perfectionist in your daily activity, your part in life, you will be that in meditation. That's the point. Those who are not that way are not perfectionists in meditation. They're not deep enough to attain a contact with God, which is so important. And so it is not so much the part you play. If this is the dream of God, which it is, what of it? If we play someone is a servant, another one is a ruler, what of it? It is not the part, it's the way you play it that counts. It's the determination to play it the best you can that counts. Because you're playing it, if you are a wise person, for one sole purpose, to please God. And you know, and I know, He'll be pleased if we play our part, no matter what it is, in the best possible way. If we play that part supremely well. Realize that. No matter what you do, play it supremely well. And to do this, we must first know God. Know that God is. We must know that. And secondly, knowing Him, we must realize that all true guidance comes from Him and sufficient power for every need, sufficient initiative for everything we do. Those are the two things which come in your effort to contact God. You know He is. You may not know all about Him, as I understand, nobody does. But you know surely He is. And knowing He is, through your soul being a part of God, you will know that there is sufficient power to direct you and guide you and give you the necessary strength to do what you should do in every walk of life. Master has given us a wonderful reference as to that point, which I would like to give you at this time. He says, meditation furnishes a twofold proof of God. Ever new joy is evidence of His existence. Master says, you know, that bliss consciousness and God consciousness are one and the same thing. In meditation you will feel that bliss. Therefore, he says, ever new joy is evidence of His existence, convincing to our very atom. When His presence comes as the great love of the infinite, every atom in your body will vibrate with His presence. And then he says also, in meditation, one finds His instant guidance, His adequate response to every difficulty. Instant guidance. You may try your best to accomplish something, it won't work. But when you give it to God by making a contact with Him, and know He is with you, feel His bliss, it's surprising how easily it is done, because of these 2 points which have brought out. Meditation gives you the realization that God is, and with that realization, you know supreme guidance and power also is with that. And so if you want to increase your initiative, make the contact with God, and He will do the rest easily. And so in conclusion, power of initiative, using the power of initiative, it must be used to consummate the goal of life. That's the important thing. You've seen many great businessmen, many artists, but that's not significant that they are a great success. If they do that, if they use their initiative, then they are truly successful. And that goal of life is consciously return home to Him whom you have successful businessman and do that? Fine. Or a great artist and do that? Wonderful. And a professional man, great professional man indeed, carry out the goal of life, then you are truly successful. That's spiritual initiative. You see the difference. You may be a great success in this life, but unless it is used to carry out the goal of life, you are not spiritually initiative. You do not have that great spiritual initiative like great masters have had and like Jesus had. And so, a man of self-sufficiency and great initiative, unless he carries out the goal of life, and does the will of God, is not truly spiritually initiative. Jesus was the greatest example. A man may be a perfectionist in his line, but unless he carries out this simple rule to attain the goal of life with his great initiative, he is not truly successful. Why? Because in the end, what does he have? Nothing. He has perhaps lots of money, great acclaim, but when he closes the book for the last time, he has oblivion, unless he knows God. So it's very important to realize the goal of life as you give impetus to your initiative. We must fulfill the goal of life. We must do the will of God. And so, great men in the eyes of the world are not always great in the eyes of God. And I'd rather be, and I know you all had, great in his eyes. And those are they, or they are those who do the will of God, who contact him, and having contacted him, they do his will. They carry out his desire. And the greatest example, of course, was Jesus. Jesus had such an initiative. He had such power that he did not need to die on the cross. He had sufficient power to scatter all those forces of evil which were leading him to the cross. He knew that. But what did he do? He bent his will, that the will of God might be done. And by so doing, dying on the cross, he took the karma, much karma, of his disciples and of all people living and those to come. That's what Jesus did. He displayed the greatest initiative by what? By carrying out the goal of life, by doing the will of God. It was much greater for him to do that because he attained eternal life and took the karma of many, many souls than it would have been to use his power to scatter the forces of evil which were dragging him to the cross. Let us remember the case of Jesus and realize that those who do the will of God exhibit true initiative. Jesus had that test. So each one of us has certain tests. But if we pass those tests and do the will of God, we too will inherit eternal life. We'll have sufficient impetus and sufficient initiative to carry out everything which God wants us to do, to play our part. And that is the goal of life. And there's nothing, just final word, to give you such initiative and such poise and such feeling of freedom and sufficient strength than the contact with God. We have the ways and the means to self-realization. To absolutely contact God is the great word, the holy vibration. Having that, you will feel sufficient strength for all your needs. And greatest of all, God will be pleased because you've done his will, and if God is pleased, nothing else matters.